I came to the town of Copper Flats as an executioner, but stayed as salvation. They said I stole a bride from death. No one knew I was desperately searching for the bride of life. And when an old oath returned in the form of a child's laughter, I understood. Some debts are paid not with blood, but with forgiveness. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The town of Copper Flats was built on illusion, at the edge of a high plateau, wrapped in perpetual cold and isolation. The village hid from the world like a thief from the law. Here lived people who wanted to forget who they were, or who had been forgotten by the world. Executioners, killers, men whose shadows were blacker than night itself. But even here, order existed. Even here, there were rules. The kind of rules written not in law books, but in the twisted code of survival that governed places where civilization had given up trying. The buildings leaned against each other like drunks stumbling home, their weathered wood gray as old bones. Snow clung to the rooftops in thick, uneven blankets, and icicles hung from the eaves like the teeth of some massive frozen beast. The main street, if you could call it that, was little more than a muddy trail carved between structures that seemed to exist out of stubbornness rather than purpose. At night, when the wind howled down from the mountains, the whole town groaned and creaked as if it were a living thing in pain. It was the third week of November when Kaine Marshall arrived in town. He was called by many names: soul hunter, death merchant, executioner without noise. People whispered his name like a prayer to the devil, careful not to say it too loud, as if the mere utterance might summon him from the darkness. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a frame that seemed carved from the same unforgiving granite as the mountains surrounding the town. His face was scorched by sun and pain, every line etched deep by years of violence and regret. His eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, gray and merciless, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. His duster coat hung past his knees, the leather cracked and faded, bearing stains that weren't dirt, but something darker, something that wouldn't wash away even with hot water and lye soap. Blood has a way of becoming permanent, seeping into fabric the way guilt seeps into a man's soul. The coat billowed slightly as he walked, revealing glimpses of the weapons he carried: a Colt .45 on each hip, a knife strapped to his thigh, and something else, something hidden beneath layers of leather and wool that spoke of a man who trusted nothing and no one. His horse was as worn as its rider, a steel-gray mare with intelligent eyes and scars on her flanks from battles fought and survived. She moved with the wary confidence of an animal that had learned when to fight and when to flee. Kaine tied her to the hitching post outside the saloon with practiced efficiency, his gloved hands moving with the economy of motion that comes from doing the same task 1,000 times. Kaine didn't come for the town. He came for one man, for the man who stole his obsession, stole his last reason for living. This was Eliza Kennon, a banker, land buyer, and slave trader of human souls. Seth controlled Copper Flats using money and fear the way other men used oxygen and bread. He was invisible until he needed to be seen, operating through intermediaries and contracts, through whispered threats and midnight visits from men who knew how to make problems disappear. He was a man who knew how to wash stains from his conscience with cold water and hot whiskey, who could order a killing over breakfast and sleep soundly that same night. Seth had built his empire on the broken backs of desperate people. He owned the bank, which meant he owned the debts. He owned the land office, which meant he controlled who stayed and who was driven out. He owned the saloon, the general store, even the undertaker's business. In Copper Flats, every coin eventually found its way into Seth Kennon's pockets, and every soul eventually bent to his will or broke, trying to resist. Kaine entered the Copper Flats saloon with the bearing of one who knows he was destined to appear here. The double door swung open with a familiar creak, and the warmth of the interior hit him like a physical force after the biting cold outside. The smell was immediate and overwhelming: unwashed bodies, stale beer, tobacco smoke, and something else, something sour and rotten that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. People whispered, scattering like cockroaches from light. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cards were laid face down on felt tables. Even the piano player in the corner stopped mid-note, his fingers frozen above the yellowed keys. The bartender, greasy and sweating with fear despite the cold, dropped a glass upon hearing the front door chime. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. Executioners recognize each other in a crowd. There's something in the eyes, in the way a man carries himself when he's made death his profession. The other hard men in the saloon, the gamblers, the outlaws, the hired guns, they all knew what Kaine was the moment he walked through that door, and they all knew enough to keep their distance. This wasn't a man you challenged unless you were ready to die, and most men, no matter how tough they talked, weren't ready for that. But in the corner of the saloon was she, a young woman, barely 20 years old, sitting at a table in the shadows as if she could make herself invisible through sheer force of will. Her eyes were blue, the deep, striking blue of a mountain lake, eyes that once blazed with fire but were now extinguished by horror and despair. They held the glazed look of someone who had learned that hope was more painful than resignation. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves just before they fall, red and gold intertwined, hanging in scattered locks around her pale face. Someone had tried to make her presentable. Her dress was cleaner than most in this place. Her hair had been brushed, but these attempts at dignity only made her situation more pathetic. She was a treasure displayed in a junkyard, beauty forced to exist in a place that had no use for it except as a commodity to be bought and sold. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tin cup of water, betraying what her carefully composed face tried to hide. On her left wrist, just visible beneath the frayed sleeve of her dress, was a brand, not burned into flesh, but carved in ink, the name of her owner written in cruel, permanent script. On her face was the invisible seal of property, the look of someone who had learned she was no longer a person but a possession. Her name was Eliza Kennon, daughter of the man Kaine had hunted for years. He recognized her from the daguerreotype he'd carried in his pocket for the last 3 months. The image faded and creased from constant handling. He'd obtained it from a private detective in Denver, part of the trail that had finally led him here, to this frozen hell at the edge of civilization. She was trapped, not just by the physical circumstances of her situation, but by something deeper, by the resignation that comes when you've screamed for help until your voice gave out and no one came, by the understanding that in a place like Copper Flats, there was no law except the law of the strongest, and the strongest was her father. Kaine met her gaze across the crowded saloon. For a moment, everything froze. The world stopped spinning on its axis. The noise faded to a distant hum, and in that moment, suspended between heartbeats, Kaine understood a truth more terrifying than any killer, more devastating than any bullet. His hunt for vengeance had led him straight to salvation, and salvation was the last thing he expected to find. He'd come to this godforsaken place to kill Seth Kennon, to put a bullet between the eyes of the man who had murdered his sister 15 years ago, who had left her body in a ditch like trash. He'd tracked Seth across 3 territories, through a dozen towns, following a trail of ruined lives and broken souls. He'd become a monster to hunt a monster, had killed men who stood between him and his revenge, had sold what remained of his humanity for the chance at this moment. But now, looking into Eliza Kennon's desperate eyes, Kaine felt something shift inside him. Something he thought had died long ago began to stir. Not hope. He was too far gone for that. But perhaps something like purpose. A reason to live that went beyond simply ending another man's life. The saloon slowly came back to life around them. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Cards were picked up. The piano player found his courage and resumed his melody, though his hands still shook. But Kaine and Eliza remained locked in that silent exchange, 2 drowning people who had just spotted each other across a dark and endless sea. Kaine left the saloon as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, pulling darkness over Copper Flats like a burial shroud. The cold rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began to fall, not the clean rain of summer, the bitter, half-frozen precipitation that seemed to cut through clothing and skin straight to the bone. It fell like a curse from the sky, like nature itself was weeping for this forsaken place and the forsaken people who lived here. The girl followed him. He didn't call her, didn't invite her, didn't even look back to see if she was coming. But her feet left a relative safety and solid ground under the saloon's covered porch and carried her into the unknown. Her worn shoes, more holes than leather at this point, splashed through mud and puddles as she hurried to keep up with his long strides. This was foolishness. Perhaps it was death, but it was also the only chance she'd ever seen, and people drowning in despair will grab onto anything, even if it pulls them down faster. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, trying to make herself small and unnoticeable. In Copper Flats, being noticed by the wrong people could be fatal. Women here learned early to walk with their eyes on the ground, to speak only when spoken to make themselves as invisible as possible. But invisibility had its limits, and Eliza had reached hers. Kaine led her through the muddy streets, past buildings that leaned at dangerous angles, past windows glowing with firelight and shadowed with poverty. A few faces appeared at those windows, watching their passage with dull curiosity, but no one interfered. In Copper Flats, you minded your own business, the people who didn't have a habit of disappearing. He brought her to a room he rented at the edge of town, in a boarding house that had seen better days decades ago and had been declining steadily ever since. The building sagged in the middle like a broken-backed horse, its paint long since peeled away, its foundation slowly sinking into the mud. But the roof didn't leak much, and the door had a lock. That made it better than most accommodations in Copper Flats. The walls were bare, stripped of whatever decoration they might once have held. The bed was narrow and hard, its mattress thin and lumpy, covered with blankets that had been washed so many times they were more patches than original fabric. A small table and single chair comprised the only other furniture. The window was boarded up from the outside, leaving only thin cracks where gray light filtered through. This wasn't a home. This was a cage, a place to sleep and nothing more. But at least it was his cage, and that meant something in a world where most men own nothing, not even their own lives. He lit a kerosene lamp, the flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. The light was dim and yellow, barely pushing back the darkness, but it was enough to see by. He pointed to the bed, and Eliza sat carefully on its edge, still trembling, every muscle in her body tensed for flight or fight. She was still prepared for the worst that a man could do when alone with a defenseless woman in a dark room. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white, and her eyes darted between Kaine and the door, calculating distances, weighing impossible odds. She'd learned to expect the worst from men. Life had taught her that lesson thoroughly. "I won't hurt you," Kaine said, and these words were so strange on his lips that it seemed he was speaking a foreign language. His voice, rough from years of shouting orders and threatening enemies, sounded almost gentle in the small room. "Almost. I'm looking for your father." Her eyes widened, the blue in them suddenly vivid with shock. The fear in them transformed into something else, a swirling mixture of emotions too complex to name. Anger, perhaps. Relief. Hope. Terror. Or perhaps something more complex than all of these combined. Something that can only be felt by one who has been close to death for so long that life becomes a foreign country with an unfamiliar language. "He killed my sister," Kaine continued, moving to lean against the wall opposite her, keeping distance between them, trying not to loom or threaten. His voice was low as thunder in the earth, each word measured and heavy with years of grief. 15 years ago, in Kansas, she was 17 years old. She was helpless. She was innocent. She was the only thing I had in this world worth having. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, with hands that had held guns and knives more often than treasures, he unwrapped it. Inside was a daguerreotype, faded and cracked but still clear enough to see the face of a young girl with kind eyes and a shy smile. Her name was Sarah. She wanted to be a teacher. She believed people were fundamentally good. That education could save the world. She died believing that, even after your father proved her wrong. Eliza stared at the photograph, and something in her expression cracked. What did he do to her? He hired her as a governess for his household back then. We were poor, and Sarah thought it was our salvation. For 3 months, everything seemed fine. Then one night, she tried to run away. A farmer found her body the next morning in an irrigation ditch. She'd been beaten, used, thrown away like garbage. Kaine's jaw clenched, the muscles working beneath his weathered skin. Your father told the sheriff she'd stolen from him, that she must have been attacked by drifters. No investigation, no justice, just a pine box and an unmarked grave. Eliza listened, her trembling gradually subsiding as rage replaced fear. Her hands unclenched, fingers spreading flat against her thighs. Her breathing changed, deepened. Her eyes, which had been vacant with despair, now burned with something that looked almost like life. "He stole my life too," she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He stole my choice. He stole my very self. My mother died when I was 12. Cholera. After that, I was just another piece of property to him, another asset to be managed or sold as needed." She looked directly at Kaine now, meeting his gaze without flinching. "When I was 18, he brought me here. Told everyone I was his assistant, his secretary, but really I was collateral, insurance. When he needed to prove to dangerous men that he was serious about a deal, he'd offer them time with me. When he needed to seal a contract, he'd promise them my hand in marriage. I've been engaged 7 times to 7 different men, and each time he'd break it off once he got what he wanted." "Why didn't you run?" Kaine asked, though he already knew the answer. "Where?" Eliza's laugh was bitter, broken. "I have no money, no skills that anyone here values. Every lawman in 3 territories is on his payroll. The few times I tried, his men brought me back within hours. The last time, he had them brand my wrist with his name, so everyone would know I belonged to him." Kaine nodded slowly. This was all he needed to hear. The details were different, but the story was the same. Seth Kennon destroyed everything he touched, leaving trails of ruined lives behind him like footprints in mud. The night was long. The rain continued its relentless assault on the roof and walls. They talked more, sharing stories of survival and loss, of dreams that had died and scars that would never fully heal. The dialogue was shorter than might be expected between 2 people forming an alliance, but sometimes words aren't necessary. Sometimes understanding flows in the silence between sentences, in the recognition of shared trauma, in the knowledge that you're no longer alone in your suffering. Kaine told her about his years hunting her father, about the trail of bodies and broken families he'd followed, about how revenge had consumed him so completely that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about anything else, about how he'd become exactly the kind of monster he was hunting. Eliza told him about her mother, about the woman who had tried to protect her daughter from her husband's cruelty and paid for it with isolation and neglect, about nights spent locked in her room, about meals skipped as punishment, about watching other girls her age courted and married while she remained her father's prisoner, about the slow death of hope, the way it doesn't die all at once but bleeds out drop by drop until you don't even notice it's gone. But in that night, in that cold, isolated room with rain hammering the boards and wind howling through the cracks, 2 people bound by hatred for one man began building something new. Not friendship, they were too damaged for that. Not love, they were too broken. But something more fundamental than either, an agreement of mutual survival, an understanding that alone they would both be destroyed, but together they might have a chance. Snow began to fall outside the window, visible through the cracks in the boards, replacing the rain with something quieter but no less cold. Kaine stood watching the white flakes falling like ash, like the remains of burned dreams drifting from a dead sky, and he understood that his path had changed irrevocably. He was no longer simply a hunter tracking prey. He was something else now, something he didn't have a name for yet. He was no longer a man seeking only death. He was a guardian, and a guardian is always more alone than a hunter, because a guardian has something to lose. The day they confronted Seth Kennon, was the day when the sky above Copper Flats looked like blood and tears. The morning dawned gray and threatening, with clouds hanging so low they seemed to press down on the earth like a physical weight. The air was thick and heavy, charged with the kind of tension that precedes violence, that electric feeling that makes animals nervous and puts an edge on every human interaction. Kaine had spent 3 days preparing. 3 days watching Seth's movements, learning his patterns, identifying his guards and their routines. 3 days making plans and backup plans, accounting for every variable he could imagine. He learned long ago that rushing into a fight was the surest way to lose it. Patience, observation, preparation. These were the weapons that kept a man alive in his profession. Seth Kennon lived not in the town proper, but on a mountain that towered over Copper Flats like a throne over slaves. His home was built on an outcropping of rock that provided both defensive advantage and symbolic power. He could literally look down on everyone else. The building itself was massive by frontier standards, constructed of stone and timber hauled up at enormous expense, with real glass in the windows and a slate roof that must have cost more than most people in Copper Flats would earn in their lifetimes. It was disguised as a temple, complete with a bell tower and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the snow. Seth liked to present himself as a pillar of the community, a religious man devoted to bringing civilization to the wilderness. But the building served as his office, his fortress, his testament to power. Inside, he conducted his real business, the buying and selling of land, of souls, of futures. Inside, he sat like a spider at the center of a web, feeling every vibration, controlling every strand. Kaine knew this. He had always known this. From the moment he'd arrived in Copper Flats, he'd been studying that building, that mountain, planning his approach. Seth was a man who loved height, not because it gave him military advantage, though it did, not because it intimidated visitors, though it did that too, but because it gave him the illusion that he could look down on the whole world from above, the way gods looked at mortals from heaven. And perhaps, in his own twisted way, in his own limited kingdom, it was true. Perhaps men like Seth Kennon were gods, at least until someone came along to prove they could bleed like anyone else. The climb up the mountain took nearly 2 hours. The trail was steep and treacherous, covered in ice and loose rocks. Kaine went alone, leaving Eliza in the town below, in the saloon where many people would see her, where she'd have witnesses to establish that she was nowhere near her father when he died. This was calculation, cold and precise. If Seth learned that his daughter had betrayed him before Kaine could finish this, the old man might have time to arrange his own revenge. Kaine had learned to think like his prey, to anticipate their moves, to stay 3 steps ahead. Kaine knew how calculation worked. He'd lived his entire life by calculations, calculating distances and angles, calculating chances of survival, calculating the cost of vengeance and blood and bullets. Every decision he'd made for the past 15 years had been filtered through the single-minded purpose of reaching this moment. The guards were easy. Seth kept 4 men posted around the building's perimeter, hard cases with rifles and suspicious eyes. But they were bored from months of seeing no real threat, and they were cold from standing in the mountain wind. Kaine approached from the north side, where an outcropping of rock provided cover, moving with the patience of a hunting cat. The first guard died with Kaine's knife in his throat before he could make a sound. The second had time to turn, to reach for his rifle, but not time to use it. The third and fourth were taking shelter behind the building, sharing a flask of whiskey to keep warm. They died together, confused expressions still on their faces. Inside, the building was warm, almost uncomfortably so after the bitter cold outside. A massive fireplace dominated the main hall, logs blazing and crackling, filling the space with heat and dancing light. The floors were covered with expensive carpets imported from the east. The walls held paintings in gilded frames, landscapes and portraits that spoke of wealth and culture. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors of Seth Kennon's power and sophistication. Kaine found Seth in his private office on the 2nd floor, a room that might have belonged to a banker in Boston or New York rather than a frontier town. The desk was mahogany, polished to a mirror shine. The chairs were upholstered in leather. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that probably had never been read. A globe stood in one corner, the kind that opened to reveal a hidden bar. Crystal decanters caught and refracted the light from the fireplace, casting rainbow patterns on the ceiling. Seth himself was smaller than Kaine had imagined. In his mind, built up over years of hatred, Seth had become a giant, a monster of supernatural proportions. But the reality was far more mundane. A man in his 50s, going soft around the middle, with thinning hair and the broken blood vessels in his nose that spoke of too much whiskey. He was dressed well, in a suit that had been tailored to fit, with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. He looked like a successful businessman, a respectable pillar of the community. He looked, in other words, like exactly the kind of evil that hides in plain sight. Seth looked up as Kaine entered, and for a moment confusion crossed his face. He didn't recognize this tall, dangerous man with death in his eyes. Why should he? Sarah had been just one victim among hundreds, one broken life in a career built on breaking lives. He probably didn't even remember her name. "Who the hell are you?" Seth demanded, starting to rise from his chair. "My guard should have." "Your guards are dead," Kaine interrupted, his voice flat and cold. He closed the door behind him, turning the lock with a decisive click. "And you're about to join them." Seth's hand moved toward the desk drawer where Kaine knew he kept a pistol. But Kaine's gun was already drawn, aimed with the steady hand of a man who had done this many times before. "Don't," Kaine said simply. Seth froze, his hand hovering over the drawer handle. His eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes, for weapons, for any advantage. He found none. Slowly, he lowered his hand and settled back into his chair, trying to maintain some dignity even as fear began to show in his eyes. "You're making a mistake," Seth said, falling back on the tool that had served him well throughout his life, words. "Whatever you think I did, whatever you think you're owed, I can pay. Name your price. Every man has one." "You killed my sister," Kaine said, and he pulled the daguerreotype from his pocket, tossing it onto the desk. "Sarah Marshall, 15 years ago, in Kansas." Seth glanced at the photograph, and Kaine watched closely for any sign of recognition. There was nothing, no guilt, no shame, no memory, just a slight furrowing of the brow, the look of a man trying to remember one piece of trash among a lifetime of trash. "I don't," Seth began. "Of course you don't remember," Kaine interrupted, his voice thick with disgust. "Why would you? She was nothing to you. Just another girl, another victim. How many have there been, Seth? How many Sarahs? How many Elizas?" At his daughter's name, something changed in Seth's expression. His eyes hardened, losing the fear and replacing it with calculation. "You've been talking to my daughter. Is she part of this? Did she send you?" "She didn't send me. I came on my own. But yes, I've talked to her. I've heard what you've done. I've seen what you've made her into." Seth's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "Made her into? I gave her life. I gave her food and shelter and protection. Without me, she'd be nothing. She'd be dead in a ditch somewhere, or worse. Everything she has, she owes to me." "You branded her like cattle," Kaine said quietly, and the quietness of his voice was more terrifying than any shout. "You sold her piece by piece to anyone who could advance your interests. You turned your own daughter into a commodity." "That's what women are," Seth replied, and now his true nature showed through the civilized facade. "That's what they've always been. Property, tools, resources to be used. Your sister understood that in the end. They all do eventually." It was the wrong thing to say. Perhaps Seth knew it even as the words left his mouth. Perhaps he saw his death in Kaine's eyes. But words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. Kaine didn't speak. Words were for people who believed that language could heal wounds, that conversation could bridge chasms of hatred and grief. Kaine believed only in bullets and in the justice that came from the barrel of a gun. His finger tightened on the trigger, steady and sure, The culmination of 15 years of hunting and planning and sacrificing everything else to reach this moment. The shot was deafening in the confined space, echoing off the walls and ceiling. The bullet passed through Seth's chest, through his heart, through the expensive leather of his chair. Seth's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His mouth opened, perhaps to speak some final words, perhaps to beg, but only blood came out, dark and thick, staining his expensive shirt and vest. Death came like sadness, slowly and inevitably. Seth slumped in his chair, his hands scrabbling weakly at his chest, as if he could somehow hold his life inside. His eyes remained open, staring at Kaine, filled not with understanding or regret, but with indignation. The outrage of a man who had believed himself untouchable, discovering that mortality applied to him like everyone else. When Seth finally stopped moving, when the light faded from his eyes and his hands fell slack, Kaine felt not relief. He felt emptiness, a vast, hollow void that he had thought vengeance would fill. Because revenge never fills what remains in the soul after loss. It doesn't heal wounds, it just makes new ones. Killing Seth Kennon didn't bring Sarah back. It didn't undo 15 years of pain and obsession. It didn't make him whole again. He stood there for a long moment, gun still raised, staring at the dead man in the expensive chair. Blood pooled on the mahogany desk, dark and spreading, soaking into papers and ledgers, destroying the careful records of a lifetime of cruelty. The fireplace continued to crackle. The clock on the mantel continued to tick. The world continued, indifferent to one more death in a world built on them. Below in the town, Eliza heard the gunshot. The sound carried down the mountain, sharp and final. She sat in the saloon, surrounded by witnesses, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When she heard that distant crack of thunder, she began to cry. Not sobbing, not screaming, just silent tears streaming down her face, dripping onto the scarred wood of the table. Each one a prayer or a curse, or perhaps both at once. She pressed her face against the old wood of the saloon table, her shoulders shaking, and the men around her, hard men, violent men, men who had done terrible things, they turned away. They gave her that privacy. Because even in a place like Copper Flats, even among killers and thieves, some grief is too raw, too personal to witness. She wasn't crying for her father. She was crying for herself, for the girl she might have been if not for him. She was crying for all the years stolen, for all the futures that would never happen. She was crying because sometimes the only thing left to do is cry, and because tears are the way the soul bleeds when words aren't enough. The days after Seth Kennon's death were days of suffocating silence, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums and makes you hear phantom sounds, whispers, footsteps, the creak of floorboards that might be wind or might be ghosts. Copper Flats learned quickly who had climbed the mountain and what he had done there. News travels fast in small towns, especially news of death, especially death of someone who controlled so many lives. The body was discovered by one of Seth's business associates, a weasel of a man named Cornelius, who came up the mountain to discuss a land deal and found his patron slumped in his chair with a hole through his heart. Cornelius ran down the mountain screaming, his voice echoing off the rocks, alerting the whole town that their master was dead. For a few hours there was chaos, speculation, accusations, fear about what would happen next. But then something strange happened. The chaos settled into calm, not the calm of peace, but the calm of relief. Like a collective exhale from lungs that had been holding breath for years. People were grateful, or perhaps simply relieved. Relief came in the form of studied indifference, the kind of willful ignorance that frontier towns specialized in when acknowledging truth would be dangerous or inconvenient. There was no sheriff in Copper Flats. Seth had never allowed one, preferring to dispense his own justice through hired guns. There was no marshal within 50 miles. There was no one to investigate, no one to ask questions, no one to pursue justice for a man who had spent his life denying it to others. The closest thing to authority was old Doc Brennan, who examined the body, declared Seth dead of gunshot wound, and promptly returned to his clinic without filing any report, because there was no one to file it with. Seth was buried 2 days later on the mountain he'd loved so much, in a grave dug by men he'd paid to work for him, attended by no one who mourned him. The preacher who'd occasionally held services in Seth's false temple spoke words about redemption and forgiveness, but his heart wasn't in it. Everyone knew what Seth had been. Some sins are too large to be buried with the body that committed them. Kaine and Eliza remained in town for another week, maybe 2. Time became fluid and indistinct, days bleeding into each other without clear demarcation. Time was blurry, like smoke from a dying fire, visible but without substance. They took rooms at the boarding house, separate rooms with locked doors, and moved through the town like ghosts, there but not quite present, occupying space without fully inhabiting it. They spoke little. Words felt inadequate, insufficient for the magnitude of what had happened. Words were for people who believed in futures, who could imagine tomorrow as something different from today. Their future seemed uncertain as mountain fog, present one moment and gone the next, replaced by something that looked solid but dissolved when you reached for it. Eliza began the process of settling her father's affairs. It turned out Seth had been far wealthier than anyone in Copper Flats had imagined. His ledgers revealed holdings across 3 territories: mines, ranches, timber operations, banks. He'd built an empire on the backs of desperate people, extracting wealth from their labor and their desperation. Now all of it belonged to Eliza, his only heir, his only surviving family. She could have kept it all, could have stepped into her father's shoes and become as powerful and feared as he had been. The infrastructure was there, connections, the fear-based loyalty. She could have ruled Copper Flats the way he had, could have continued his work, could have become him an address. Instead, she spent those 2 weeks liquidating everything. She sold the mines to the workers who'd been laboring in them, sold them for pennies on the dollar. Enough to make the transaction legal, but not enough to burden them with debt. She sold the ranches to the families who'd been working them. She forgave debts, hundreds of them, destroying promissory notes and mortgage contracts in the fireplace of her boarding house room, feeding them to the flames one by one, and watching as years of suffering turned to ash. The bank she deeded to the town itself, to be run by a committee of citizens rather than the single corrupt tyrant. The false temple on the mountain she had torn down, the stone and timber salvaged and distributed to families who needed building materials. Within 2 weeks, it was as if Seth Kennon's physical empire had never existed, dismantled and scattered like dust and wind. But the psychological scars, the damage done to human souls, those would take longer to heal. Perhaps they never would. Kaine watched this transformation with something approaching awe. He'd spent 15 years becoming a monster to hunt a monster, had shed his humanity piece by piece in pursuit of revenge. But Eliza, who had more reason for bitterness than anyone, who had suffered more directly and more personally than even Kaine had, she chose differently. She chose to destroy her father's legacy not through violence, but through generosity, to fight evil not with more evil, but with unexpected mercy. One evening, as the sun set over Copper Flats, painting the snow-covered town in shades of gold and crimson, Kaine and Eliza sat on the porch of the boarding house. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always did when the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Their breath created small clouds in the cold air. Around them, the town was coming alive with the sounds of evening, doors closing, conversations drifting from open windows, the distant bark of a dog, the closer sound of horses being led to stables. But in this uncertain limbo between old life and new, something unexpected began to grow. Eliza began to laugh. It started as something small and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through snow in early spring. At first it was almost like a hiccup, involuntary, as if her body was trying to expel something foreign that had lodged in her throat. The sound was rusty, unpracticed, as if her vocal cords had forgotten how to produce joy. But then it became real laughter. The kind of laughter that comes when a person remembers they're human, that there's still something inside them capable of feeling besides pain and fear. The kind of laughter that's half surprise at finding yourself still alive, still capable of joy even after everything that's happened. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, from a place that had survived her father's cruelty, from a reservoir of humanity that couldn't be fully destroyed no matter how hard someone tried. She laughed at small things: a dog chasing its tail in the street, a child making faces at his mother, the way the wind made the sign outside the general store swing and squeak. She laughed at nothing at all, just at the sheer improbability of being alive and free. And each time she laughed, Kaine felt something shift inside him, some frozen part of himself beginning to thaw. Kaine watched her in those moments with an expression that might have been wonder on a less scarred face. Something was happening in his heart, something strange and unprecedented. His hatred, which had been the organizing principle of his entire adult life, which had given him purpose and direction when everything else had fallen away, it was beginning to transform into something else. Not love, not yet. He wasn't capable of that, wasn't worthy of it. He'd done too many terrible things, killed too many men, sacrificed too much of his humanity on the altar of revenge. But perhaps it was hope. Hope that two broken things might, if they were careful enough, if they were patient enough, if they were kind enough to each other, create something whole. Hope that redemption wasn't just a word preachers used to fill church pews, but a real possibility. Hope that the future might be something other than an endless repetition of past trauma. What now? Eliza asked one evening, breaking a comfortable silence. They were sitting at the edge of town, on a bench someone had placed there years ago. Before them, the land dropped away into the valley below, where real civilization existed, towns with actual laws, schools, churches, futures. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the landscape and sky, like a small bird's song in an endless forest. Kaine didn't answer immediately. He looked out at that valley, at the fading light turning everything soft and dreamlike. He thought about the years he'd spent hunting, the trail of bodies behind him, the man he'd become. He thought about Sarah, his sister, and whether she would recognize him now, whether she would be proud or horrified by what he'd done in her name. "Now we leave," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. "We leave and never look back." "Where?" Eliza turned to face him, and in the twilight her eyes were the color of the sky just before full dark, that deep blue that's almost purple, almost black. Kaine looked at her, and in his gray eyes was something that resembled hope, though it was tentative and uncertain, like new ice on a winter pond, present but fragile, capable of bearing weight, but also of cracking and plunging you into freezing water. Somewhere the past can't find us. Somewhere we can be people other than who we've been. Somewhere we can start again. Does such a place exist? Eliza asked, and the question carried the weight of someone who had learned that geography rarely solves problems that live inside you. "I don't know," Kaine admitted with rare honesty, "but I'd like to find out, if you'll come with me." They both knew, though neither said it aloud, that the past always finds you eventually. Always. Memory isn't something you can outrun, no matter how fast you ride or how far you travel. Trauma doesn't respect state lines or territorial borders. Guilt follows you like a shadow, present even in darkness. The things you've done, the things that have been done to you, they're carved into your bones, written in your blood. You carry them everywhere. But perhaps, they both thought, perhaps running away together was different from running away alone. Perhaps shared trauma, acknowledged and witnessed, lost some of its power. Perhaps two people fleeing the same past might find something in each other that solitary flight could never provide. The next morning, they prepared to leave Copper Flats. Kaine saddled his horse and bought another for Eliza, a sturdy roan mare with gentle eyes and a patient temperament. Eliza packed the few possessions she'd chosen to keep: her mother's locket, a book of poetry, the clothes on her back, and one spare set. Everything else she left behind, abandoned like the life she was fleeing. As they rode out of Copper Flats in the early morning mist, a few people watched from windows and doorways. No one tried to stop them. No one called out. But there was something in those watching faces, not quite blessing, not quite approval, but perhaps understanding, perhaps recognition that sometimes the only path forward is away, that sometimes salvation looks like flight. The mountain where Seth had died rose behind them, already looking smaller, less significant. Soon it would be hidden by distance and terrain, just another peak among thousands. And Copperflats, that town built on illusion and cruelty, would fade into memory and eventually into story. One more place that existed in that uncertain territory between history and legend. But neither Kaine nor Eliza looked back. Looking back was for people with something to return to. They rode forward into morning, into uncertainty, into whatever waited for them beyond the next mountain range. And if that wasn't quite hope, it was at least possibility. And sometimes, when you've lived in hell long enough, possibility is all the heaven you need. They had been running for a month when the past caught up with them. A month of sleeping under stars and in hay lofts, of campfires and cold camps, of slowly learning each other's habits and tolerating each other's silences. A month of putting distance between themselves and Copperflats, riding through territories where winter was loosening its grip and early spring was beginning to emerge, snow melting into rushing streams, the first brave flowers pushing through frozen ground, birds returning from southern migrations with songs that sounded like promises. They'd found a small town called Silver Creek, tucked into a valley where three rivers met, a place that seemed to exist outside of time and trouble. It was the kind of town people came to for fresh starts, where questions about your past were considered rude, and no one cared what name you'd been born with as long as you paid your debts and didn't cause problems. The kind of place where Kaine and Eliza thought they might finally rest, might finally stop running long enough to figure out who they were when they weren't defined by suffering and revenge. They took rooms above the general store, again separate, still maintaining that careful distance even as the space between them grew smaller in other ways. Kaine found work at the livery stable, using skills with horses he developed over years of travel. Eliza took a position teaching at the small schoolhouse, discovering that she had a gift for reaching children that her father's cruelty had never quite destroyed. They ate dinners together at the boarding house's communal table. They took walks in the evening when the workday ended. They began, tentatively and carefully, to build something that looked almost like a life. But peace, when it finally arrives after years of war, often feels more like the calm before a storm than true tranquility. And Kaine, who had survived this long by trusting his instincts, felt the change in the air before he could name it. He noticed the stranger before the stranger wanted to be noticed. A man watching from across the street, another following at a discreet distance during an evening walk, a third asking too many questions at the saloon about newcomers to town. The name reached him like winter whined through a cracked wall. Victor Gray, Seth Kennon's oldest friend, his business partner in ventures so dark they couldn't be discussed in daylight, his sworn brother in a code of honor among thieves and worse. Victor was a man who made Seth look benevolent by comparison, a man for whom cruelty was not a means to an end but an art form to be practiced and perfected. The stories about Victor Gray were the kind that parents used to frighten children into obedience, the kind that hardened men whispered about over whiskey, the kind that turned your blood cold even when you sat close to a fire. He'd started during the war. No one was quite sure which side he'd fought for, or if he'd fought for any side but his own, and had emerged from that conflict with a taste for violence that peace couldn't satisfy. He'd killed for money, for sport, for the simple pleasure of watching life drain from a person's eyes. He was worse than Seth because Seth at least pretended to civilization, at least maintained facade of being a legitimate businessman. Victor embraced monstrosity. He didn't hide what he was. He was proud of it. And now he was here in Silver Creek, with 8 men at his back. 8 hard cases with empty eyes and full-gun belts. Men who killed for wages and slept soundly afterward. Kaine recognized the type because he'd been that type, had traveled in packs like this, had taken money to end lives. He knew how they thought, how they operated, what they were capable of. Victor had tracked them for a month, following a trail of questions and rumors, moving with patient inevitability. He'd made inquiries in Copperflats, had learned about Seth's death and his daughter's flight. He'd followed them through 3 territories, always a few days behind, never quite catching up, but never losing the scent either. And he'd sworn, loud enough for word to reach Kaine through the Frontier's efficient gossip network, that he would avenge Seth Kennon, that he would make Kaine suffer before he died, that he would take everything from Kaine the way Kaine had taken everything from his blood brother. And what Victor understood, what made him particularly dangerous, was that the best way to make Kaine suffer wasn't to kill him. It was to kill Eliza first, slowly and painfully, while Kaine watched helpless to prevent it. They came in the dead of night, when darkness was deepest and most complete, in that hour before dawn when human vitality is at its lowest ebb, when even those standing guard feel sleep pulling at them like a physical weight. They came through the window of the general store's second floor, glass shattering in an explosion of sound that transformed silence into chaos in a heartbeat. Kaine woke to that sound, instinct bringing him to full alertness before consciousness fully caught up. His hand found the pistol under his pillow. He'd learned long ago to sleep with weapons close, and he was moving before his eyes fully opened. The door to his room burst inward, cheap lock offering no resistance to a booted kick. A man filled the doorway, gun raised, but Kaine was already shooting. The first intruder fell backward with a hole between his eyes, dead before his body hit the floor. Two more came through the door in rapid succession. Kaine shot the first in the throat, the second in the chest. But there were more, always more, flooding through the narrow hallway like water through a breach in a dam. The quarters were too close for rifles, so it became a battle of pistols and knives, of grappling and desperate violence in confined spaces. What happened next was chaos given form, violence made manifest. It was the kind of fight that leaves no clean narrative, just fragments of sensation and action. The smell of gunpowder thick enough to choke on, the flash of muzzle fire in darkness, creating split-second freeze frames of struggling bodies. The sound of men grunting, cursing, dying. Blood slick on the floorboards, making footing treacherous. The metallic taste of fear and adrenaline coating the tongue. Kaine was skilled. Kaine was fast. Kaine was a professional who'd survived 100 fights that should have killed him. He moved through the attackers like a dancer through a macabre ballet, each movement economical and deadly. He shot one man point blank. The pistol pressed against the attacker's ribs before firing. He slashed another's throat with the knife he kept strapped to his forearm. He broke a third man's neck with his bare hands when both their guns ran empty. But there were too many, and even the most skilled fighter is still only human. A blade found his side, slipping between ribs with the practiced ease of someone who knew anatomy, who'd done this before. The pain was immediate and breathtaking, sharp as lightning, cold as winter morning. It stole his breath and his balance, sent him stumbling against the wall. Blood, hot and wet, spread across his shirt. He could feel it, could feel his strength beginning to leak out through the wound. But even bleeding, even weakening, Kaine kept fighting, because in the room next door, through walls so thin you could hear conversations, Eliza was screaming, not the scream of terror but of fury, the sound of someone who refused to be a victim again, who would fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. Eliza wasn't a trained fighter. She'd never fired a gun until 3 weeks ago when Kaine had taught her, making her practice until her hands stopped shaking. She wasn't physically strong. Years of near starvation under her father's control had left her thin and weak. But she wasn't helpless. She wasn't passive. She'd learned, through brutal experience, that passivity was its own form of death. She'd burst from her room when the shooting started, Kaine's spare revolver clutched in both hands. Her hands trembled, making the gun shake violently, the barrel describing small circles in the air. Her eyes were closed. She couldn't bring herself to watch what she was doing. Couldn't bear to see the results of pulling that trigger. But she fired anyway, squeezing the trigger again and again, sending bullets into the darkness with desperate hope rather than aim. One of those wild shots, fired more in panic than precision, found a target. One of Victor's men, a scarred brute who'd killed more people than he could remember, dropped with a surprised expression, blood spreading across his chest from a wound that punctured his lung. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, dead or dying. Eliza stared at him in shock and horror, the gun falling from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. The sound of that gun hitting would seem to break some spell. The remaining attackers, there were 4 still standing, including Victor himself, paused, reassessing. They'd expected easy prey, a quick kill followed by leisurely torture. Instead, they'd walked into a meat grinder. Half their number were dead or dying. The hallway was a charnel house, and their targets were still fighting. Victor, who'd been hanging back to let his men do the dangerous work, finally showed himself. He was a tall man, taller even than Kaine, with the lean build of a wolf and eyes that held no more warmth or mercy. His face was all hard angles and sharp edges, handsome in the way a knife blade is handsome, beautiful but deadly. He smiled, and that smile was worse than any snarl. "Kennon," he said, using Seth's surname like a weapon, making it sound like a curse. "You've cost me good men tonight. I'm gonna make you pay for every one of them. But first," his eyes shifted to Eliza, "I'm gonna make you watch while I finish what should have been done to her years ago." 2 of Victor's remaining men moved toward Eliza. She backed away, looking for the gun she dropped, but it had slid under a table, out of reach. Kaine tried to move, tried to put himself between them and her, but his wound betrayed him. His leg gave out, sending him to one knee. Blood was pooling beneath him now, a dark stain spreading across the floorboards. He was losing too much blood too fast. Even if he survived the next few minutes, unlikely. He might not survive the next hour. But Kaine had spent 15 years learning to fight past pain, past fear, past the body's instinct for self-preservation. He'd learned to push beyond human limits in pursuit of his obsession. Now, for the first time, he pushed those limits for someone else's sake rather than his own. He lunged forward with the last of his strength, tackling one of the men approaching Eliza. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and curses. Kaine's knife, slick with his own blood and that of several others, found the man's throat. But the effort cost him. The knife wound at his side tore wider, pain white-hot and absolute, and darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision. Eliza screamed, ran, not away but toward. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from where it hung by the stove, weaponizing the domestic, turning the tools of civilization against those who'd abandoned it. She swung it with all her strength, catching the last of Victor's men across the temple. The sound was like an axe hitting wood, solid and final. The man dropped instantly, either dead or unconscious, and in that moment it didn't matter which. That left only Victor. He looked at the scene around him, his men dead or dying, his careful plan in ruins, his prey refusing to behave like prey, and something that might have been respect flickered across his face. Or perhaps it was simply the acknowledgement that sometimes, even when you hold all the advantages, fortune turns against you. He could have pressed the attack. He was fresh while Kaine was wounded and exhausted. He was armed while Eliza had only a skillet. He could probably have killed them both if he was willing to risk taking a wound in return. But Victor had survived this long by knowing when to fight and when to retreat. Dead men can't collect vengeance. Sometimes patience was its own kind of victory. "This isn't over," Victor said, backing toward the stairs, his gun trained on them, but not firing. "You can't run far enough. You can't hide deep enough. I'll find you again, and next time, you won't see me coming." Then he was gone, disappearing down the stairs and into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a scene of carnage. 6 bodies, maybe 7 if you counted the one Kaine wasn't sure was dead. Blood everywhere, and 2 people who'd somehow survived, but at a cost that would take years to calculate. Eliza dropped the skillet and ran to Kaine, who was still on his knees, swaying, his hand pressed against his side, trying to stem the bleeding. She caught him as he started to fall, lowering him as gently as she could to the floor. His blood soaked into her nightdress, warm and sticky. His face was pale, lips blue-tinged, eyes starting to lose focus. "Stay with me," she whispered, cradling his head in her lap. "Don't you dare leave me now. Not after everything." Kaine tried to speak, but blood bubbled at his lips. The knife had done more damage than he'd thought. His vision was narrowing, the world retreating to a tunnel with Eliza's face at the end of it. Beautiful, he thought with surprise. When did she become so beautiful? That night, While Eliza kept watch in the town, doctor worked with needle and thread and prayer to keep Kaine's life from leaking out through that knife wound. Kaine made a choice, not consciously. He was too far gone for conscious thought, drifting in and out of fever dreams where the dead walked and the past wouldn't stay buried. But in that twilight state between life and death, he made the choice to hold on, not for revenge, not for justice, not for any of the reasons that had kept him alive before. He held on for her, for Eliza, for this woman who'd swung a skillet like a sword, who'd fought when she had every right to surrender. He held on because guardians don't abandon their posts. Not while breath remains, not while the heart still beats, not while there's still someone worth protecting. And when dawn finally came, gray and cold and clean, Kaine Marshall was still alive, barely but breathing. And in that moment, that was enough. The snow was falling heavily when they left Silver Creek 2 weeks later, fleeing once again because staying meant dying. The doctor had done what he could, sewn up the knife wound, dosed Kaine with laudanum for the pain, warned him that traveling in his condition was suicide, but staying was certain death. Victor Gray was still out there, regrouping, recruiting new men, planning his next attack. Towns talked, and Silver Creek had seen too much violence. Questions were being asked, questions that would lead to more violence or to law, and neither option served Kaine and Eliza. So they rode, Kaine barely able to sit his horse, Eliza leading both animals through mountain passes, where snow fell thick as curtains, where visibility extended barely 20 feet ahead, where the cold was so intense it felt like breathing shards of glass. They rode through terrain that would have been treacherous even for a healthy man with a good horse and clear weather. For a wounded man and an inexperienced rider in a blizzard, it was borderline suicidal. But sometimes suicide looks like the only path forward. Sometimes you ride toward death because it's the only direction available. The trail wound higher into the mountains, climbing toward passes that would be impassable within another month when winter fully reasserted itself, when spring's false promises retreated and the old gods of ice and stone reclaimed their domain. The horses struggled, their hooves finding uncertain purchase on ice-covered rocks, their breath creating clouds of steam that froze in their nostrils. Eliza's hands were numb inside her gloves, her face raw from windburn, her body shaking from cold that seemed to penetrate through layers of wool and leather to settle in her bones. Behind them, perhaps a mile back, perhaps less, it was hard to judge distance in snow. Victor and his remaining men followed. Victor had learned caution from their last encounter, but he hadn't learned retreat. He tracked them with the patience of a winter wolf, staying far enough back to avoid ambush, but close enough to prevent escape, waiting for weather or wounds or exhaustion to do his work for him. Smart predators don't spend energy, they don't have to. They just wait for prey to weaken. They reached the last pass, just as afternoon was bleeding into evening. The snow had become a full blizzard, wind howling through the narrow defile like the screams of the dead, visibility reduced to almost nothing. Kaine could barely see Eliza, and she was directly in front of him. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable. It was deadly, the kind of cold that makes you sleepy, makes you want to lie down in the snow, just for a moment, just to rest, and then you never wake up. Kaine's wound had reopened during the ride, fresh blood soaking through the bandages the doctor had carefully applied. He could feel it, warm against his skin even as the rest of him froze. He could feel his strength ebbing, feel the darkness at the edges of his vision that wasn't just a failing light, but his body beginning to shut down. He'd lost too much blood, pushed too hard for too long. Even the strongest can't overcome physiology indefinitely. He reined his horse to a halt. Eliza, sensing the change, stopped as well and turned back to look at him. Even through the driving snow, even with her face half hidden by her scarf, he could see her eyes, blue as mountain ice, bright with fear and determination and something else. Something that looked like love, though he didn't deserve it, didn't know what to do with it. "Keep going," Kaine said, his voice barely audible over the wind. He had to shout to be heard, spending precious breath on words when every breath was becoming harder. "Follow this trail down the other side. You'll reach a valley in maybe 3 hours if you push. There's a town there. Small place, but it has a church with a blue door. The priest is named Ferguson. Tell him." He paused, coughing, blood on his lips. "Tell him Kaine Marshall sent you. Tell him it's time to pay a debt." "No," Eliza said, and though her voice was quiet, it carried absolute conviction. "I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice." Kaine began to dismount, a process that took far more effort than it should have, his body protesting every movement. "Victor and his men will be here soon. I can hold them here, in this pass. Buy you time, but only if you go now." "I won't leave you to die alone on a frozen mountain," Eliza said, and now she was crying, though the tears froze on her cheeks almost before they formed. "Not after everything. Not now." Kaine managed to get off his horse, nearly fell, caught himself against the animal's flank. "You can't help me," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way it had never been when discussing violence, in a way it hadn't been since he was young, and his sister was still alive, and the world hadn't yet taught him that gentleness was weakness. "I'm a hunter. That's all I ever was, all I'll ever be. But maybe," his voice broke, "maybe I can be something else for you. Maybe I can be a bridge between death and life, between past and future. Maybe I can give you something I could never give myself." The sound of horses drifted through the blizzard, still distant, but getting closer. Victor had caught up faster than Kaine had hoped. Of course he had. Bad luck followed bad men the way crows followed battles. Kaine moved to Eliza's horse, reaching up to touch her face with his gloved hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, tears continuing to freeze on her cheeks. He pulled his hand away and pressed something into her palm, a small leather pouch that clinked with coin, money he'd saved, not much but enough to start over somewhere new. "Live," he said, and it was both command and plea. "Live for both of us. Find that town, that priest, that blue door. Tell my story if you want to, or don't. But live. Build something. Be happy. Be free. Be everything I couldn't be." He kissed her forehead, one brief touch of lips to frozen skin, the only kiss he'd ever given her, the only tenderness he'd allowed himself in 15 years. "You made me remember what it was like to be human. Thank you for that. Now go." Eliza wanted to argue, to refuse, to fight, but she saw in his eyes that this wasn't a discussion. This was his choice, perhaps the first truly selfless choice he'd made since his sister died. She couldn't take that from him. So she nodded once, unable to speak around the grief choking her throat, and turned her horse back to the trail. She rode maybe 20 yards before she stopped, unable to help herself, and looked back one last time. Kaine was standing in the middle of the narrow pass, his rifle in his hands, facing back the way they'd come. Snow swirled around him, already beginning to cover his tracks, to erase evidence of his presence. He didn't turn around, didn't wave, just stood there, a dark figure against white snow, a sentinel between her and death. Then the snow closed in, and he was gone from sight, and Eliza had no choice but to ride forward into whatever future he'd bought her with his life. Kaine didn't have to wait long. Victor emerged from the blizzard with 4 men at his back. He'd recruited replacements quickly, or perhaps these had been following at a distance all along. They reined up when they saw Kaine standing alone in the pass, rifles at the ready, blocking the trail. "Where's the girl?" Victor called out, though he must have known the answer, must have understood what Kaine was doing, standing here alone, wounded, making a last stand so someone else could escape. "Gone," Kaine replied simply. "And you're not following her." Victor smiled his knife blade smile. "You really think you can stop all of us? You can barely stand." "I don't have to stop you forever," Kaine said, raising his rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel with practiced ease despite his shaking hands and failing strength. "Just long enough." The fight that followed was both brief and eternal, compressed into minutes that felt like hours. Kaine's first shot dropped a man on Victor's left, a perfect shot through the heart despite the wind and snow and his own weakness. His second shot hit Victor's horse, not what he'd aimed for, but effective nonetheless. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider, creating chaos in the tight confines of the pass. But then return fire came, a volley from 3 rifles, and Kaine felt new pain blossom at his shoulder, his leg. He fired back, worked the lever action, fired again. Another man fell, but there were still 3 left, and Kaine was running on fury and determination now, his body moving on instinct and muscle memory, because conscious thought was becoming difficult. A bullet found his chest, high on the left side. This one hurt differently than the others, deeper, colder, final. This was the shot that kills, Kaine knew with the certainty of long experience. This was the wound you don't recover from. He dropped to one knee, the snow beneath him immediately staining red, his rifle falling from hands that no longer had strength to hold it. Victor stood, limping from his fall but very much alive, and approached carefully. His remaining men flanked him, guns raised. They'd won. They all knew it. "Should have taken my offer to make it quick," Victor said, standing over Kaine. "Now you die slow, bleeding out in the snow like an animal." Kaine looked up at him, and despite the pain, despite the cold, despite death reaching for him with frozen fingers, he smiled. Blood stained his teeth, but the smile was genuine. "She's gone," he said again, "and I made sure you can't follow. Avalanche territory ahead. You go through now. In this storm, you'll bring the whole mountain down on your heads." It was a lie, but Victor didn't know that. And even if he had known, the point was made. Eliza had enough of a head start that catching her now was impossible. By the time they navigated around this pass, by the time they found another trail, she'd be long gone. "Safe. I hope she was worth it," Victor said bitterly. "She was," Kaine replied, and meant it, "more than you could understand." Victor raised his pistol, aimed it at Kaine's head. For a moment, they were frozen there, a tableau of victor and vanquished, hunter and prey, past and future balanced on a knife's edge. Then Victor pulled the trigger, and Kaine Marshall's long hunt finally ended. The snow beneath him was red, spreading like flower petals blooming in fast motion. The stars above, just starting to become visible as the blizzard began to ease, were bright and cold and pitiless. And when Kaine closed his eyes that final time, his last thought wasn't of revenge or hatred or regret. His last thought was of Eliza, riding towards safety, of her face, her eyes, her laugh, of the future he'd given her in exchange for his past. And in that moment, dying in snow and blood and cold, Kaine Marshall found something he'd thought lost forever. He found peace. Eliza did find the town with the blue church. She did find Father Ferguson, who wept when he heard Kaine's name, who explained that Kaine had once been a boy in his parish before war, and tragedy had twisted him into something else. She told him everything, about her father, about the rescue, about the chase, about the sacrifice in the mountain pass. And Father Ferguson listened and prayed and offered shelter and healing and hope. She stayed in that town. She taught children in the small school attached to the church, discovering within herself a gift for bringing light to young minds. She wrote a song about a man who had been a monster but became a savior, a man who traded his life for another's freedom. The song spread, carried by traveling preachers and wandering musicians, and over time people forgot that Kaine Marshall had been a killer. They remembered only that he had been a guardian. Years later, when spring finally came to those mountains and the snow melted from the high passes, someone found bones in the defile where Kaine made his stand. They buried them properly, with a marker carved from local stone that read simply, "Guardian." No name, no dates, just that single word. And on that mountain, where snow fell white as forgiveness and covered all sins equally, where wind carried no judgment and cold showed no favoritism, Kaine Marshall's body became part of the earth, part of the stones, part of the legend, a lesson carved in blood and ice, that even the darkest hearts can find redemption if they're willing to pay the price, if they're willing to give everything they have for something greater than revenge, for something as simple and profound as love. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.